we last time? Let's see. I think in this tutorial, we had just started allowing the knight to be dragged, but we didn't have a drop capability yet, and we just started splitting some of that out into this board square. So if I remember, all right, good. Just checking that again. This board square, what happened here is we just have our simple square component that we originally had. That where is it? I'll put it next to the board square since they're sort of the same thing. Close this constants because I don't think we're going to need it again. The square here, right, is naive. It doesn't have any props other than the children passed into it. So it's it doesn't have anything else that, oh, I guess it has, like, is it black or not, right? So it's just black or white. It's very simple. It doesn't know its position. But one of the problems with that is if it doesn't know its position, how can you know where the piece was dropped when you drop it, right? How can you update the piece's position from a drop? And so that's what this board square is doing, is it's taking a lot of that logic about knowing what your actual position is and encapsulating it. It used to be part of the board where, I don't think we need to go into this index. I'm going to close that. Used to be part of the board where we had a whole bunch of the logic right here for the render square. How are we going to, what's our position and all that. But there, just sort of getting the X and Y, doing the rendering, but then we pass those actual position information into the board square. And what we're doing with that is we're just holding on to it here. We want it in our props so that when we're going to be figuring out where we drop and updating our information for our knight, we give it the information about the square that it dropped on. And since the drop targets are going to be our squares individually, each square needs to be able to tell the item that was dropped, like, hey, here's where you were dropped. Here's what happened. So that's where we were at last time. We also did, and we haven't talked a lot about this. So I mentioned it a couple times, but just prop types are just a way to help validate this board square being this new piece or whatever. It has two properties, an X and a Y, and they're just numbers. So we looked at that a little bit before, seeing like, oh, it'll let the prop in that it needs. And this is purely to help you in debugging or making sure that you're building your application right. It doesn't translate into anything that happens when you're running it on the server. On a what's known as a production build, so you strip out stuff and you minimize your code and whatnot, all the prop type information gets stripped out of the code. It's only useful while you're working on it. And then we updated our board so it renders a board square instead of rendering the squares directly that we had before. So now, now we're going to do this sort of drop target wrap. So it says, now let's wrap the board square with a drop target. I've got that over here open, but the reason is we have our drag source already, right? And we've said our knight is our drag source. So if we collapse all of this, our drag source, and this is setting up a whole bunch of information about what happens when you're dragging this guy, and then we're passing in our knight component saying this is what actually gets dragged. And we need to do the same thing for a drop target as well. We need to hook it up so that information is in there when, and all of what this looks like to help maybe clarify what these functions are doing, although there's a decent amount of complexity sort of going on with this stuff. But since the drop target is our board square, that's where we're going to implement that logic. And then in this tutorial, it sort of breaks it out piece by piece first, building some stuff up before we get down to the whole file. So we'll We'll come back and talk about these two pieces in just a minute. But we're going to look at in this entire file, and I'm just going to be lazy here and grab the whole thing here and bring it over rather than typing it out again. So we can look at this. Before we were just pulling in the React and the component prop types in the square. So what's changed? Well, now we're also pulling in this can move knight and move knight from our game. So these are our functions that we have to allow us to move or figure out, is this a move that we're allowed to make? And we're going to be pulling those in because now the board square itself is what actually is going to take this action when the knight gets dropped on it, right? We're pulling our item types because we need to know what type of item can be dropped. So that's used right here, information. And then we're pulling in drop target from React drop because that's what we're hooking up. So that's the new imports. And then if we look at this drop target and what this means, I'm going to get rid of our props. Before were just X and Y. So that's telling us what this expected as props before. And you'll see here now the board square props are X, Y, connect, drop target, and is over. But again, like we looked at with the knight a little bit, that connect, drop target, and is over, they're not being set on our board square here. And that's because what's actually happening here is this collect function along with this drop target connector. This thing is going to essentially wrap our board square with a component, but we're just not seeing that component. Component is going to add the connect, drop target, and is over board square when it renders. This isn't a perfect example, a perfect comparison, but it's almost like you have this in your code or whatever. You had drop target board square as a component. Just going to take props. And what it's going to do is just render your board square. I mean, as I said, but it's going to render your board square with whatever props were originally part of the board square. And so I'm going to ignore that a little bit. And then it's going to add in this is over property, which is going to be a function of some kind, and the connect drop target. So that's how it's getting those properties added to it. They're getting injected by this. One term for something like this is a higher order component. So they're getting injected by this higher order component, which essentially is something that takes a component in, the board square here, and returns another component, adding some behavior of some kind. So the things that this is just like the drag source. It needs a few items passed into it. So if we look at our drop target here, let's look at ES6 version. It says what it needs is it needs types, which is a string, an ES6 symbol, an array of either or a function. This drop target will only react to items produced by the drag sources of the specified types or types. So of course, since our drag source is a knight, because that's what we're specifying its type as here, we need to tell it you're allowed to respond to knight drop targets. And it seems a little maybe redundant, or like we're doing some busy work when you're doing something this simple. But the reason you have it is because you can imagine this application being much more complex, or other much more complex applications where you've got different types of drag sources and drop targets, right? Like ours, where if you could drag a lane around, you wouldn't want to be able to drop a lane in a note. So you'd need to say like, I don't know how to handle those. I only know how to handle notes. Next thing we take is this spec, and it says it's just a plain JavaScript object with a few allowed methods on it. Describes how the target reacts to drag and drop events, and it's going to have some details for that down below. So the spec we're defining up here on our square target, and we'll sort of come back to that in just a second. And then the last item it takes is collect. And what collect's doing is grabbing some properties from React drag and drop itself, this connect. So, and that's going to be used to hook up these new properties that we're injecting, which are really connecting us to information about what's going on. So isOver uses this monitor information from React drag and drop to figure out, are we over this component right now? And connect is connecting up the drag source or the drop target itself so that it's going to know how to like connect. And we use that inside of the function or the component where we render. And that's going to say, oh, here's how you actually, or what you're connecting up. This is the drop target that you're trying to connect up. So now going back, the other thing that we implemented here, square target. And that's defined here. And this is the spec. And so what it means by the spec or whatever is this is what you're actually defining for functions. So if we don't, wrong tab. If we scroll down a little bit, the specification is the object that you're implementing that actually does the work for the drag and drop behavior. And it's got a certain set of attributes or methods that you're allowed to use from this spec, because these are going to be called directly from the React drag and drop. It's like, oh, the spec can have any of these, and I'll try and call these if it's the right time. If they don't exist, it doesn't work. So the three that you can have are drop, hover, and can drop. So you can take actions essentially when somebody drops something on you, when somebody's hovered over you, and if somebody can drop on top of you, you can take different actions for each one of those. Code, it's pretty basic. We implement the drop, and that's going to take the properties. So essentially, it takes the properties of your component in this drop. And the action we're going to do is just move our knight. So we're calling our move knight to say, go ahead and drop it when we do that. So this should, let me check, make sure I'm not missing anything now. By implementing that, we've got almost everything in place. So it should have rebuilt, oh, wrong one. And now we should be able to drag this guy around. And see that it's giving us this different color on every square. All right, but we've got a little bit of a problem there, right? What did we have before is we had logic that allowed us to only drop on if it was a valid move. But now we're able to drop it anywhere, which isn't what we really want. In case you were wondering where that color came from, the collect, remember, this is adding properties to our component, and one of those properties it adds is over. And so inside of our component now, whereas before we didn't have anything, now I've got a little bit of logic here. So this is our original div, this is the internal square, and then here's another bit of logic that it's got, which is saying if isOver is true, then go ahead and render this div as well, which is just another div on top of our existing component, which is a yellow square, the same size as our component, which is how we're drawing this. So whenever you're over one of these, is going to be true, and it's going to render this extra bit of HTML to give you that yellow styling. Does that make sense? Through there? Yes, no? Yeah? All right. So we've got all that done. Now, like I said, we want to only be able to drop on a square if it's actually valid. Well, we have our can move night information, and that spec that we were looking at defined a can drop method. So we're just going to hook those two up. We're just going to add a can drop into our spec, which is right up here. And that can drop will just call can move night, which is going to return true if you can drop. Now what we're missing still, let me check here. So now the cool part is it already won't let us drop on any of these other squares. It's smart enough to not let it happen, because that can drop is being called when we do drop, and it's React Dragonfly's going, nope, not allowed, not true. But we can add some additional logic just to do some styling around that. This is where he says, I'm also adding monitor can drop to my collecting function, as well as some overlay rendering code to the component. So you can monitor to see if can drop is true as well. So we can pull that over into this. And that's part of the monitor or the collecting function, not part of the spec. And then this is sort of a refactor of the code, but it moved this render overlay up into here and lets it take a color in. So it moves that out of the render and up into a separate property here. And it's indented all wrong, but oh well. There we go, that's fine. And now we got a little bit of extra logic here. We need to pull off our can drop from our properties, like we're pulling off the other ones. And then the only difference that we're really doing here is, instead of directly rendering if we're over, we added a little bit of conditional logic, which says if we're over and we can't drop, it's not a valid drop target, then render it as red, the overlay. If we're over, not over, but we can drop, render it as yellow. And if we're over and we can drop, render it as green. So that's just a replacement for this logic right here that was doing this can drop logic. And instead now it's got 3 optional conditional paths to rendering this overlay, and the overlay now takes the color in as an option. So now you can see when I'm right here, we already have as yellow the places that's valid for me to drop. And that's because what's going on is every one of our board squares is running through this logic every time we render. It's going to be updated as we move around and re-render each one of these components. Square right now, but it's not a valid place for us to drop, so it's going to be red. These ones are valid, so they're yellow, and then when we get over them, they're going to turn green. And the green's a little easier to see on the white ones, but that's telling us, yep, that's a valid drop target, valid drop target, valid drop target, and none of these are. So as we're moving around, React drag and drop is continually updating our board squares and re-rendering them with the new props for is over and can drop that are being set from this function, is over and can drop. And every time it re-renders it, that changes this overlay to do something a little different. And we're only allowed to drop on the ones that we can drop on, because if we can't drop, it'll just return it. Oh, I should add a can drop to my my prop types too, to make sure I'm testing everything out correctly, or that I'm doing validation correctly as I'm developing. So can drop right up in here. That won't make a difference to the function of the code. It's purely for development purposes. So that, I mean, I know that's, we dove in from where we were last time. This just generally makes sense the way that some of this is taking place. The function that takes some arguments and wraps another component, new props, that's seen before, but we haven't talked a lot about. We see it in our existing code where, what's a good example? Where we're doing the connect logic, it's doing the same thing. It's injecting additional props in. This is just a little more explicit, I guess, in the way that it works and what we're doing there. So now he's like, all right, we're pretty much done, but we could do something fun. So let's add a, last thing I want to demonstrate is drag preview customization. It says, sure, the browser will screenshot the DOM node, but what if we want to show something different? And that's what's going on here, is the browser screenshotting the DOM node as you drag it. But maybe you want to show something different when you drag. A prime example of that is on Trello, for example, which is, you know, an app like ours, a Kanban board. It rotates the item or whatever, right? So you see something like shifted, so it's not the exact same thing snapshot by the browser. It's like, oh, I rotated, and now I'm dragging this sort of rotated thing. It's just an extra visual clue that you're dragging something. Let me see if I can. Logged into Trello? I probably am not. Oh yeah, the welcome board. I think it still does it. So you see it sort of tilts the card. And that would be different than what the browser would snapshot by default. Because it's just changing that behavior a little bit. And we can do that very easily. In fact, we can render something entirely different, which is what it does in this tutorial. Is we need to add a connect.drag preview to the collecting function of the night. So this is, we're adding something that's telling it what do you actually render when you're previewing the piece. Oh, where's my collecting function? Here we go. Oh no, this is prop types. Oh, it's up here. All right. So my collect function, we want to connect drag preview, which is just going to connect to whatever. This is the way, again, you're hooking it up to the React drag and drop bit so that it knows how to call and hook things up. And we're going to add this sort of component did mount. This is part of the React lifecycle. If you remember when we talked about that component lifecycle. So when this component first gets mounted into the DOM, into your browser window, this code is going to run. And it's doing this at that point in time so that the image hopefully is finished loading before you actually drag it and need to show that preview image. And all it's doing with this bit here for the component did mount Image is not defined. Image is defined in the browser, but is creating a new image object and setting it to this base64. So this is a way to encode an image directly into just JavaScript or something. You don't have to reference an external file. That's all that's happening there. It's base64 encoding of that image. So it's a big, long string of characters. I don't even know how long the line goes. Click to see more. It's a long line. So all those characters are just an encoding for the image, a way to encode it in something that you can put directly in code. And then this onload bit right here is hooking something up so that when this image object that we created, a DOM image object, so part of the browser, finishes loading, then what it's going to do is call this connect drag preview that we hooked up and say the image is my drag preview. So this is what you're going to use whenever you're previewing my drag, and that should, if all goes well, change it so that we get the silly little horse head. And that could have been something entirely different if we didn't want it to be an image. We could have
different icons.
It could be a different icon. It could be, if we did this entirely differently, we could have even,
So why didn't they use
like we could make a little div here, I think, or whatever. So const drag preview equals, like, I'm going to make it a component, but it's not going to do anything with the properties, so I'm not going to even include them. I think this will work. React drag and drop can be tricky at times, so I might get burned here. Make it a span. Is that the right spelling for nay? Anybody know? I hope so. So let's see if this works. I don't know if it will. We're gonna try it. So instead of this, we're gonna drag preview. We're gonna do our drag preview component. May or may not work. It may not allow me to do a React component directly for that. I don't know. Yeah, I think I pushed it too much. Let's do an error. Read property X. So put this back the way it was. Let's see if it's. Shouldn't be getting the error now, I don't think. All right, yeah. Connect our preview. Maybe this will work. I'm going to try this. I don't know. I'm going to try and just do it in line like this. Oh, I know what's wrong. Oh, well. I'll worry about that later. So that behavior. You could also, and I said that the tilt is an example of how you would do this, like to tilt the card, for example, when you started the drag. Well, you could theoretically do the same thing in here, just by knowing that you were dragging. So you can change your style of your component while you're dragging as well. So we are using is dragging to change our opacity, but we could change just about anything else we wanted. So we could add in a
background change or something.
yeah, I want to do a transform or something, but those are a little that's right. I'm gonna check something over here real fast. Let me just have fun. Now let's do 0.5. Oh, this is let's try that. Oh, of course that doesn't matter because I'm not rotating. Hold on. Let me get rid of this. I don't know. Something a little off. Could be my rotate. Could be, I could say degrees probably. Let me try it one more time and then I'm going to give up. 180 degrees. Let's see if it works. Ah!
Oh, yeah.
It did, except it's the opposite of what I wanted.
It was the opposite, right?
Because it must be applying when it's not dragging. Oh yeah, because I have my transform applying all the time, or something. So yeah, I would need to change this to only apply something like is dragging, then rotate 180 degrees. Otherwise, like none or something. I don't know if none is the right way to transform it, but yeah, it's not. Anyways, I do this sometimes, by the way, just to encourage you guys to play around with stuff like this too. You should feel free just sort of goofing off like that and seeing what happens, because that's one of the best ways to learn anything. Like, I didn't know some of that stuff, exactly how it was going to work or what would happen. All right. Any questions on this before we move on back to the book? It's his final chapter. Okay, what's up? No? All right. Let's jump back over to our Survive.js tutorial. I need to change my, I think for the first time in one of these classes, I haven't yet. So git checkout -b. Do I have this? I don't think I do. I don't think I have a branch for this yet. No. So I'm going to create a branch because I want to work in a branch that is dedicated to this. That way, if I ruin everything, I can just go back to my master as long as I didn't commit and I'm back at the start before I did this chapter. I hope that people have been using strategies like that as well to help them just, not break anything that they're working on. So let me get this open as well. npm start to get stuff running. In the background, we're working on this, and then we should be able to close all tabs. Be done with this, and we're going to step back over to our Kanban app. This is one of the first times I haven't already got all the chapter stuff in place before we're going to dive in here. So this will be a little bit more live than we're used to for some of this. But I think that's fine because we're going to see the parallels more easily between what we just did for the just React drag and drop tutorial and what we're doing here. So this whole thing is going to be setting up React drag and drop. It's really the entire chapter is just giving us a way to move these notes from one lane to another. And one thing that I really liked about the React drag and drop tutorial that I feel like they did backwards from how I would build something like this if I were doing this is they had all of the function in place already before they worked on how to do it through dragging and dropping. So you were able to move note or move your piece around. You knew if you could drop it on that square. All of that was implemented first. So essentially your program was fully functional from the behavior model. And then you just had to add the UI layer on top of it. This is taking a little bit of the opposite approach. We're starting with all the drag and drop bits, and then we're going to add the functionality in underneath. I think the other approach where you're trying to build out your functionality, make sure all that's working, and then hook up your UI works a lot better because it's much easier to build up that way. When you start at the UI level, and you've done all of this, but you don't have the function underneath, and then you add that function underneath, if you have a problem like a bug or something went wrong in what you were doing, it's a lot harder to isolate which part of that stack of everything that you just did is the thing that's causing your problem. Whereas if you sort of built it up one piece at a time, test it out, all right, this is working, oh, something's wrong, 90% chance it's in what you just worked on. Whereas this approach is sort of starting here, and it's going to add stuff all the way down, but you don't know if anything's working until you've reached the very bottom, which makes it hard to debug sometimes. That's just sort of a personal preference of how to build some of that stuff up. So we get started, we need to add this drag and drop context, which is this very high level bit, to our app. That's the exact same thing that we had to do to our, it's going to be totally different now. Because now it's my, oh, yeah, I need to get rid of that code, huh? That I didn't keep around. That was me just blowing away the tweaks that I'd made to try and add some of the lane stuff at the bottom. So now we're back to the way I had it before. Perfect. So the first thing we're going to do is add this top level stuff. And this is just the way that your application knows, like drag and drop is wrapping all of this. This is how the React drag and drop is going to inject the stuff in across everything. So we add in some imports. And for the most part, these should look like the same thing that we were doing before. And we should feel comfortable with most of these. But there's probably at least one of those imports that is a little new, or maybe you have some questions about. I want to see if they use, yeah, they use a different model than me. I usually, when I'm importing stuff or whatever, this is just a personal preference. I like to separate out these third-party ones. I usually just leave one line between, like, here's ones that I pulled in from somebody else, and here's ones that were part of, like, my application, so it's easier for me to see that. So we're going to import that stuff, and then we need to hook it up. And that's right here where we're swapping out our previous export with this new one. So we use that as an opportunity to talk about what's changing here. We've got a lot going on. But I'm going to need to customize this just slightly. So before, we were just connecting, and that was what we were using to hook up our Flux, our alt store, to everything. And we were getting lanes and settings and out of our store, and we were adding into our component lane actions and setting actions. That Connect was taking all this stuff and then taking the app so it could inject them into it, right? So that pattern looks almost exactly the same as what we were doing to hook up our drop target or our drag source for React drag and drop, where you've got a function that takes some parameters to set some things up. it returns another function that takes your component to inject that functionality into it. So that's why I was saying we've already used that pattern a fair bit. Now we're changing it just slightly in this new approach where we're using something called compose. I'm going to keep my settings here. I didn't have before. The only difference all this compose is doing is making this read a little better. I'll show you, we'll destructure this to show you what it looks like without it. That compose is just a way to make stuff read a little easier. So without that compose, what you end up with is context with the HTML5 backend. And that's going to take this connect with all of the bits that you're connecting. We're actually, hold on, I'm building this backwards. Connect is going to take, oh, man. Use some nested stuff here. What's the right way to nest this? So yeah, so the drag and drop context bit with the HTML5 backend. Oops. Yeah, let's do that. So it calls that, but then inside of that, it's going to take this whole connect. Results of evaluating this connect because it's wrapping its behavior as well. And so you get this really, it begins to get pretty ugly as you're nesting things and then nesting things inside of them. And then that's going to take your app, the result of evaluating all of that. So the way you end up having to read that, if you're trying to structure it like this, and if you're trying to add something in is, okay, first it has to go all the way to the inside and evaluate this. So it evaluates connect, and connect is taking these parameters and returning something that's going to take a component of some kind. So it's going to return a function that takes a component. And the drag and drop context takes this HTML5 backend and returns a function that takes a component. Well, this is a component as well that's going to get injected into here, and then eventually it's going to take the app. So you can see how that's pretty hard to read. And as you add more and more things, it gets harder and harder to compose because you have to nest them inside of the parentheses of each one. And I said harder and harder to compose, and that's all that this compose is doing. It's just a function that you can pass in a whole bunch of functions to compose, and it'll essentially do that nesting one by one. So you could give it as many functions as you want that operate that way and just sort of compose them up together. It's really all that's happening with that. So let's see if this is working right, because I just played around with that code a lot. All right. So this compose, all it's doing is hooking up our drag and drop context and then our connect to our app. That's the easiest way to think about this. It's different functions that are hooking up behavior and wrapping it. Make sense? We can write compose if you really want to. It's a little tricky just to get right, but it's a pretty small little function to write as well. So now, all right, well, we just did our React drag and drop tutorial, and one of the things that we needed were item types, right? For the night, because that was really the only item that we had in there. Well, we need the same thing here. We need to define what our item types are in some way. Well, we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to create an item types property here, and I don't think we have any constants folder yet, so we're going to add that under our app. And inside of there, we'll make our item types. JavaScript file and just export this object, this unnamed object, so it'll only be named wherever you're importing it. Just so that I followed their syntax exactly in case anything else goes wrong. I'm going to rename this lowercase I for item types. So what are the other two things that we needed for the React drag and drop? If we've wrapped all of our context, what are the two sort of most important bits?
Source.
We need something we're dragging and that we want to drag, and somewhere we want to drop it, right? So those are sort of the next bits that we're going to implement here. Now that we have our item types, we can start implementing our dragging and our drag source. So, all right, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to bring in our item types and our drag source. Drag source coming from React drag and drop, item types from our thing, and this is going into our note because we want our note to be the thing that you can drag around, right? So our note, which was very, very basic before, is going to add a little bit more logic in here. And then a lot more logic around the rest of it. So again, this is a pattern I use a lot where I'll like leave the old thing there just for a moment, just to make sure I didn't miss anything if I'm developing it. If I'm refactoring and trying to figure out how to get it all written out, a lot of times the old item will stay around for a little while. But in this case, you know, just copied it over. We'll go over what we're doing here. So this should look pretty much the exact same as what we're doing before, right? We're setting up a drag source. We need to tell it what item type it says it is when it's getting dragged. We need to give it the spec for dragging. And in that spec, we're doing something on begin drag. So we're connecting it so that when we begin dragging, we're just going to log something. And then this connect is injecting some properties into our component that we're going to hook up to, which is our note. And so we're going to inject the connect drag source, which we go up and look at our note. Written a little different than it was written in our tutorial where we use classes, but this is pulling off the connect drag source, children, and any other properties. And again, just wrapping our what we're returning from our render with our connect drag source so that it can inject that into it. So really the exact same pattern that we had before, just written out a little differently. Go ahead and compile that real fast, and let's see what happens. In our console over here, sweet, we see that it tells us we've started dragging whenever we start dragging something, right? And it's logging the different information that we have. So we look at that real fast. We told it to log begin note dragging and the props. So if we look at this real fast, the props we have our class name of note, some sort of on-click, a children array. Even if you weren't certain what those properties were coming from, I think it would be pretty reasonable for you to be able to look at this note and begin to figure out, oh, those props are the items off this guy. We've got some children. We've got some props getting passed in, which if we looked at notes, when it renders a note, it gives it a class name and an on-click, right? And then these children of button and editable. So that maps perfectly. Class name note, some sort of on-click function, and an array of two children. So we're getting the properties right off of that component, and that's just what we're logging here. Make sense so far? All right, so yeah, we're working. We can see our information being logged. But the problem is we can't drop yet, right? So we don't have any drop targets. So then this is an interesting question. I think there could be different answers to this, but where if you were thinking about this beforehand, you know, not based off of whatever the tutorial used, where would you guys want to be able to drop the notes, like when you drag it over? Like, where do I want to be able to drop this? Inside another note? I mean, yeah, I think that makes sense, right? Like inside another note. Or even if I'm dragging it right here, drop it on another note. Because you could think also, you could have said, oh, maybe I only want to drop it on the lane. But that would probably make it really hard to drop if you didn't have some sort of thing that allowed it to cascade up, because it's not going to get that. Now, I will say one cool thing that React Drag and Drop has to help deal with that is it has nesting. So if you set it up correctly, this is really cool to look at to understand how this works. But if you set it up correctly, it'll tell you like, oh, see, all of these triggered the drop. So it's possible to have the drop on just the lane, for example, and have it handle all of it. But it may have some implications about how you would do it, for how you would handle the information, how you would know how to shift your notes around or something like that. All right. So allow them to be dragged. Yes. So now it's like allowing notes to detect hovered notes. So now we're gonna get a little more complex, because is the same component now is both a drag target and a drop target. It's not actually the exact same instance of that component, but the same component in code is both a drag target and a drop target. Oh, I don't need this open. So now instead of just having our drag source, we're adding the drop target that we want to get from here. And because we're going to wrap it multiple times the same way that we were doing at that root level, we're going to use this compose to make it a little easier to read, instead of having to sort of nest them in the more complex fashion. And then, of course, we need to add in this connect drop target on our properties. We want to pull that off. We're going to want to wrap it around our component here. And if we didn't use this compose, the way you would do that is it begins to get a little complex. You're going to wrap like connect drop target like this. And so, you know, if you can see how adding more of those, it gets a lot harder to read nested things inside of other nested things. Whereas compose at first can be a little harder to read as well. But eventually it simplifies stuff, especially when you add in more and more. So here we can say, all right, we want to connect our drop target and we want to connect our drag source. And since we're doing that, I don't need this. Oops. Multiple connect. I don't need that original connect drag source. And then all of that should take our div that we're wrapping around here. Oh, they did it in the opposite order. I don't know if it matters the order. Connect drag source, connect drop target. It may or may not. Just for consistency's sake, I'm going to go with the same. So none of that's really changed. We still have our begin drag that we're going to do when we're the source, but now we're going to add in some target logic as well, because this is part of our spec for being a target. So this is our spec for a source, a drag source. This is our spec for a drag target. And hover is one of the methods defined in your spec for a drag target. And then the last bit here, this is where it would get really, really ugly if we didn't have compose. Now, mind you, you could make it easier. These don't, like, the connects don't have to be written in line here. Tutorial we had before, we wrote them externally. But compose makes this a lot easier to work with than it would be otherwise. Where if we didn't have this compose method, you'd have this drag source, which sets all this stuff up and would have to be there, but then that would have to be wrapped inside of something else. And yeah, it just gets much, much harder to read. So at this point, cross our fingers, hope everything went well. We should have some sort of drop target as well. And now we're seeing this, I mean, it's just all sorts of events being fired. So you can see them all over the place. And I think if I go real fast, the events aren't firing anymore because I'm not over anything that's a valid drop source. And even if I'm right here over the lane, very carefully, not firing, but the minute I go over another note, it's firing those events continually as I move. So if I don't move, I believe, let me see. No, it just keeps firing them. It keeps checking to see, I guess, if it's a drop source. But so the one that was firing repeatedly there was not our, oh, it's because it's hover. Yeah, because it's continually checking for hover. Was not our note source, but our hover was firing over and over and over again. That's why you can see it saying, like, dragging note, dragging note, dragging note. Any questions on that so far? Yes.
How well does that scale? Like, if it's scanning to see like where it's being dragged over.
That hover logic?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can end up with some delays around some of that. There is, for example, let me see if I can find this. I'm going to be able to find this. There was a, I think this is what I'm looking for. Maybe. There's a like other alternatives to React drag and drop. And they have one of them. It might be this one. Might not be. Oh yeah. Massive performance improvements. They did a lot of work, and they have a whole talk on what they did to improve the performance because of the way some of that stuff works, right? So you can do some work to, I mean, this would be a very deep read if people wanted to get into that. That would be good, diving very, very deep to a whole bunch of different topics. But yeah, there's some performance implications. If you had a ton of different items that were on the screen at the same time, it could cause some performance problems. One of the nice things about some of that, not all of it, but one of the nice things that React does for you is React does improve the performance of that stuff just by using React versus if you had written this without it. And that's because of some of their virtual DOM layer and virtual event layers add some real efficiencies around how a lot of that stuff works. But otherwise, yeah, it's a good question about performance. Definitely has performance implications. Any other questions so far? No? All right. We might go a little bit farther, and I want to leave some time to help out with any problems that people have as well. So I hope, by having done the other tutorial, this stuff looks very similar. It's just following the same pattern. Here's the type. Here's our spec that we're defining up above, and here's our connector adding some properties into our component, right? So nothing too fancy compared to what we were doing. The only difference now is the same item is both a drag source and a drop target. It's also using this term. It says both decorators give us access to the note props. That's what these, you could sort of call these, or these guys here, these specs, decorators. They're decorating it and adding in some other styling. Let me see here. Where's the tutorial? That's actually a term that has some actual meaning as well, because here we've got something that says ES7, and I don't think these actually made it into the latest version of ECMAScript. I can't remember. But one way to add, I need to go down a little bit more. One way to add some of this stuff on in another way, as opposed to that sort of compose that we have and wrapping them down at the bottom, if you're using some of the newer syntax, is, I know it's going to be here somewhere. Here is a different syntax to do it, where it's sort of wrapping this whole class, and it's not even actually wrapping it. It's just a line above it where it says like at drag source, and here's some other stuff. This is what's known as a decorator. So in other languages, you'll run into that term, like other programming languages, and it's something new to JavaScript as well. But that way you can sort of add some new behavior into like this knight, but this knight doesn't have to have implemented that behavior himself. And the decorator syntax is just a little bit of a nicer way to write this same thing here. It's a newer syntax. I don't think it's natively supported on anything. I can't remember, but it's another way to do the same thing. So the next bit we have is, all right, now we're going to start, let's start up some bits, right? We can move notes around. We can start to define logic. The following steps are needed. Capture the node ID on begin drag, capture the target node ID on hover, trigger on move callback on hover so that we can deal with the logic elsewhere. And lane store would be the ideal place for that. So at this point, it should, we'll go through the little bit of this here, and then stop there. But I think before we dive into that, let's ignore the drag and drop bit and capturing the ID and stuff directly. We're going to be essentially doing the same type of thing that we've been doing before, right? We've got a new action of some kind that we want to be able to process and manipulate and capture and update our application, right? We want to take an action, update our store, update our application. So can anyone, off the top of my head, I don't know if I can do this, but remember what the different things that we need to do for any type of action that we've been adding to our application are? What are the steps that we've done when we've added other ones in, like adding a note or adding a lane? Add. We need to have a store for it. We need to define what the action is, I guess. That's, I think, in our actions. And then we need to define what we do when that action happens. So that's what that goes in store, if I remember right, at least in the way that we've got our stuff built out. And then we need to have something that can invoke that action, obviously, but you can call that anywhere. And then we need to hook that stuff up to our components so that they can invoke it, but that they also get the information off of it, right? So that's where we connect it up. So I think those are the major pieces. So we're going to have that eventually for like this on move as well. But first, we're sort of hooking up. Again, this is doing this top-down approach, and so we're going to hook up some of this stuff and stub things out. So for our note here, we're going to add in our move. And that's just another one of these. Where is it? Right up here, right? This is another item that we're adding in here. Doesn't really matter where in our list. So we're assuming we're passing in some sort of on-move property to our note. And then for our note source here, we change the behavior for begin drag. You can see all it's doing now is returning the ID props.id. Now here's the truth. For me, at least, I'm going to take a slightly different approach to doing that. And that's because I want to make sure, like, as I'm debugging all of this, I want to make sure that this stuff is firing the way I expect it to be firing. And that these drag events are happening. So I'm leaving the console login for the time being. And that's just because I want to make sure this is happening in case when I hook all this up, something's wrong. I at least have something telling me, yep, begin drag is occurring. You know that that's happening, right? And then I can pull it out once everything else is working because I don't need it there anymore. Then we've got our note target, and this one is much more complex at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and just take it right over, and we'll look at what changed here. Actually, let me just take the hover bit so we can put it right next to the other hover. Or not.
Can you remind me? Oh, so like the on hover, the hover and the on move.
Right.
Are those coming straight from React?
No, those are coming from no, those are coming from React drag and drop.
Oh, okay, those are going.
Yeah.
Okay.
So React drag and drop is the one that knows how to handle those and hooks them up however it wants to hook them up. So you're asking, like, ultimately, where does it come from? In this case, it is going to hover, at least whether or not you're hovering is coming from HTML, and that's because we're sort of using this HTML5 backend, so it sort of knows what's going on. It's an action that it knows about, but there are other optional backends that you can hook up to, so that things like, you know, on drag and things, those can use a different backend where the behavior would be different. So there's the touch backend where you can move stuff around, and the behavior is a little different with that. Like, I'm not sure exactly how hover is connected there, but they still have hover. They may just do something different, like, oh, I assume you actually tapped down on it or something for the hover in that case. That's why it allows you to do those different backends. So we changed here. Let's take a look at, compare our old hover versus our new one, right? We can't change the properties because that's defined by React drag and drop, what it's going to call us with. And we're still going to get our source props off of our item. But now we're also going to add in, we want to get our target ID. And that's what we were trying to drop onto from our target props, or what is trying to be dropped. And the source ID, which is the ID of the item that you're currently on, that you're hovering over. No, I have those backwards. Target ID is the target of the item that you're over, and source is because it's the drag source. So again, I put this console login back for the time being, and that's just because I'm not confident about this code yet, so I want something here to help me out. And then the last bit of logic that we have here in the hover that was new logic as well is now we're checking if our source ID is not our target ID. So if we're not over the same note that we're dragging, then call the onMove method of the target, passing in both our source ID and our target ID. And remember up here, we just added onMove into our note. So it's got a method that attached to it that we're going to be able to call. So that's really pretty much all I think that you need to do at this point in the the note itself. But the thing that we're missing is we're not adding an on move into the note yet, right? So we've hooked up all this logic saying we're going to call on move when we're hovered over something. We want to move stuff around. But, well, A, we don't have any of the back end about what move means. But we also aren't adding this on move into our notes. And it's not coming from React drag and drop. It's not part of the stuff that we've connected up here. So we need to go ahead and pass that in, which is where we're going to step up into our notes, right? And so here, we're going to add some logic into our notes where each note now, instead of being hooked up the way it was before, or having just what it had before, it's got a few new properties added to it. We're going to pass in the ID. We're going to pass in an on click. Well, that's the same thing that we were doing before. We're going to pass in an on move though as well. And that's the stub, if you will, for the behavior we're going to eventually have here to actually, oh, that is the wrong level. To actually perform some action when we move, right? So now we should be able to, barring something going wrong, we move this. We can see we're getting that moving from event firing. So at this point, I'm feeling good about my my drag and drop bit doing what I expect it to do. So now I would come back in here myself. I'm like, all right, I feel good about this now. I don't need these comments to confirm that this code is working anymore. So I can get rid of that, and we should have a much cleaner bit of output that we're seeing over here now. Easily, right? It's telling it to, and that's something that's going to happen in this case. I don't actually think we even work around that behavior, but it's not moving anywhere, and that's because we're not hooked up anywhere on the back end in terms of actually what are we going to do when we move. But we're getting this nice message telling us we would do something. So I think that seems like a good breaking point because we've sort of gotten through the React drag and drop bit of this now. So we've hooked up all the, I mean, there's some more, but this first pass of the React drag and drop stuff, we've hooked it all up, right? The next part, for anyone who hasn't already gone through that, well, this should be very similar to stuff that we've done other times. We're going to be hooking up the action, right? We're adding a move. We're, adding some lane actions in here. We're doing some on-move behavior of some kind. We've got it all hooked up, and then we're going to do something when we move. And you can see, again, at first, it's just doing this console log. But that should all be very routine, and then we'll finish the rest of this, implementing the rest of the drag and drop logic where it's actually going to move stuff around and being able to move our lanes around and stuff in the next class. Sound good? Awesome.